This week we're talking about establishing authority in your academic writing, especially, but in all of your writing and your presentation generally. Basically, that boils down into two separate considerations. The first is becoming an authority, so actually being able to be objective enough as you're considering a question so that you can form an opinion that is based in facts, yes, but also in context and understanding enough about what you're talking about in order to then come to a valid conclusion. The second thing that we talk about here is seeming like an authority to your reader so that you can actually present the conclusion that you've drawn, the valid conclusion you've drawn based on the authority you've established for yourself. Taking that and then being able to present it to an audience in a way that they will accept, and how to present yourself as someone who is credible and reliable and who really does possess the authority that you already know you possess. So those two questions, we do want to think of them as separate issues, but hopefully they're bound up, becoming an authority and then presenting yourself as an authority to the audience. Both are necessary for good persuasion. So the first step, establishing your authority. This is why we research context. This is the purpose of your project too. What we want to do is take in enough information, not just about the idea that you like, and then maybe one opposing viewpoint, but all of the potential conversations that are going on. Taking in enough history, enough background, covering enough ground that you actually can take in any of the number of conversations that are going on around your subject and say, yes, I understand why this is happening. I understand where these viewpoints are coming from. And I understand them well enough and objectively enough that I can decide where the most reasonable path lies. Now, this is one of the hardest things to do in the whole world. This is the reason that we spend so much time this week having you think about your own writing, where your biases lie, how you take in news, what news sources you pay attention to. We live in a world right now that's very easy. It's just very easy for all of us to separate ourselves from anybody that might disagree with us, and not just about little things, but about basic fundamental understandings of how the world operates. The more you know about your own biases, your own perspectives, the more you're able to recognize when you are insulating yourself from other points of view and perspectives, and then the more you're able to engage ethically with people that you might end up in conversation with and who might ultimately change your mind. Remember, I'm hoping that you're choosing topics you're willing to change your own mind about as you research. But this is why it's important to pay attention to which sources you're looking at, how credible they are, why you chose them, what appeals to you. This is why it's important to pay attention to the rhetoric that other people are using on you. It's also important to recognize when we're dealing with facts and objective information, and then when we've moved into subjectivity. And I hope you've taken a look at that objectivity and subjectivity PowerPoint that's in our work for this week, but just a brief mention here. Remember, facts, objective information, those are things that exist. Those are things that we can prove true or untrue, things that we can measure. Those are the things that we ultimately will put to work for ourselves when we're coming to conclusions, and then when we're trying to persuade other people of our conclusions. We have a bad tendency, culturally, to say the facts speak for themselves. They virtually never do. All a fact can do is give you that one piece of information. It's our job, it's your job as a thinker and then as a writer to put those facts to work in order to come to some bigger and larger conclusion. Facts can't give us ethics. That's what we're paying attention to. That's our job. So as you're working on your project too, I want you to practice being a person who can separate yourself from the information that you're taking in and make some kind of objective judgment on the rhetoric that's being used and the validity of all of those sources of information. Now we turn to the second part, which is the presentation of your argument and the presentation of yourself as an authoritative person on the subject. Your Project 2 does not ask you to make an argument yet. Your Project 2 is just a presentation of the context around two issues. But ultimately, you will be making an argument once you get to your researched argument in Project 4. And that's when you're going to need to present yourself as an authority in order for your reader to recognize you as someone they'll believe. Just like we're able to insulate ourselves from people we disagree with, our readers are able to isolate themselves from us or to disengage with us if they sense bias, if they sense that we're not actually going to give them something that feels true and feels objective. Starting now, you want to present yourself as someone who knows enough to have come to the right answer. You want to take yourself, as much as you can, out of the literal writing that your reader will see. That's why I don't want you to write in the first person, not when you're establishing context. The only time in academic writing that you should use the first person, I or we, is when you're talking about you specifically as a subject of research. Otherwise, you seem like you're just coming to some kind of opinion. An opinion is one way that we tend to discredit other people's writing and other people's thought. Think about that for a minute. Just like we have a bad tendency to think that the facts speak for themselves when they virtually never do, we also have a bad tendency socially of saying, well, that's just my opinion and you can't argue about it. The truth is, every argument is in some way an opinion. It's subjective. It's a conclusion that we've drawn based on evidence. Ultimately, you're going to want your audience to come to the same conclusion you've come to, and you want to give them the evidence that got you there, and you want them to draw that same conclusion, but before they do, they're going to need to think of you as someone authoritative enough to lay it out. So you want to remove those first-person pronouns from all of your writing so that this becomes true for all time, something that is seemingly objectively true, even though you are making a subjective argument. You also want to remove, and this will be true in all of your writing for this entire semester and for your academic career, remove the second person completely. Y-O-U, you and your. I'm going to suggest, and I'm sure that I will do it actually in many of your papers as well, just because it's the way that we tend to talk. Do a word search for you and your throughout your paper at the end and remove it completely. Because when you start speaking in the second person or writing in the second person, to the reader, A, it will sound informal and just a little bit less authoritative. But B, it sounds like you're making assumptions about the reader. It sounds like advertising. And that's the clearest and quickest way to turn your reader off, because then it feels like you're selling, not like you're laying out evidence for a case that really can't be argued with. And that's what you want to present to your reader. So, this week, you're going to be thinking a lot about how you take in news, where your bias lies, how you take in information, period. You're going to be thinking about the writing you've done up to this point and evaluating where your strengths and weaknesses lie, where you think you can improve. And then also you're going to be working on your project 2, peer editing your project 2. You're going to be considering how authoritative, how complete, how objective have I been, and how objective am I seeming. Ultimately, you're going to pursue one of these 2 topics that you're looking at. Potentially, you could use the context that you lay out in this project when you're making your argument to help bolster your credibility for the reader in your project 4. Are you already doing that now? Do you feel complete? If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm looking forward to reading your work.